Alright, hi everyone. I hope you guys are having a great day today. So today's lecture is going to talk about the theories of Maslow. So you may have heard of Maslow before, talking about his hierarchy of needs. We're going to see in just a second that Maslow is one of the founders of humanistic psychology, which really came out of a reaction against some other types of personality theory, some of which we've already talked about, some of which we will talk about later in the semester. We'll get into more of that in a second. Please do remember that we have an activity this week that's going to be due by Friday at 5 p.m. Also, it's never too early to start thinking about Exam 2, which is going to be released after next week's lecture video. So let me know if you have any questions as you start preparing for that. We will have a review video and a practice exam just like Exam 1. So let me know if you need anything. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and get into lecture for today. Alright, so as I said, today we're going to be studying the theories of Abraham Maslow. Now, Maslow is often considered one of the founders of a humanistic approach to personality. And we're going to see when we talk about Carl Rogers next week that he's also going to fall in this category of humanism. So when we're referring to humanism or a humanistic approach, it's the idea that we should focus primarily on the values and the interests of our clients. Humanistic psychologists were particularly disturbed by psychoanalytic ways of thinking about personality, as well as more behavioral ways of looking at personality, which we haven't yet touched on, but we will later on during the semester. So they would say that Freud focused too much on negative aspects of personality or on individuals who were disturbed, that Freud was talking about individuals who had personality problems, and that made it seem like every person had personality problems. On the other hand, they would also be offended or have issues with a behavioral view of personality, which, as you'll see later on in the semester, is going to insinuate that everything that we are is because of reinforcement and punishment from our environment. So they took a different approach to personality in suggesting that the majority of people are actually fairly well adjusted, and that perhaps the best way to look at personality is to study individuals who are not having psychological issues. So instead of choosing to do our research on individuals who have personality issues and problems and then developing our theory around that, on the other hand, humanism is going to be a search for well-adjusted individuals and try to figure out what is going right for those individuals. So with that as a background, we're going to be talking today about Maslow, and his theory is often called a holistic theory here. It assumes that the whole person is motivated by one need or another. So you have already seen with some psychodynamic theorists, like Freud, for example, the idea that maybe perhaps we have different kinds of motivations going on at one time, and different parts of our personality are in conflict with each other. We're going to see a different approach here with the idea that we are motivated by needs, and the majority of Maslow's theory is going to talk about the motivations and the needs, but it's that our entire being is striving toward the same needs. So maybe we do have unconscious influences, but they're reaching towards the same things that our conscious influences are as well. It says people have potential to grow towards psychological health. So you're going to see this week as well as next week with Rogers, that it's the idea that all of us were created for psychological health, that all of us maybe have the ability to achieve psychological health, but that maybe somewhere along the way something got in the way of that. Something is preventing that or making that difficult. So we all are driven towards psychological health, and something that you'll see in Maslow's theory is this idea of self-actualization, which is going to be kind of the peak of psychological health, which we'll talk more about in a bit. You're also going to see that the lower needs must be satisfied before the higher needs can be met. So you might have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's kind of like a pyramid. So at the very bottom, we have those needs that are the most basic needs. So they're the simplest needs, and in a lot of situations, maybe the easiest needs to meet, but they're also the most important ones, and often the ones that we do meet to the greatest degree. And so we'll see that the lower needs have to be met. It's like we have to lay a foundation before we can build upward. So those lower needs typically are satisfied more than the higher needs and are more basic and more foundational to a person. And you'll see this as we go on. So briefly talking about Maslow, Maslow was born in New York City. He was the oldest of 7 children. He had very significant issues with his mother. As an example of this, one of the books that I have read about Maslow mentioned that he had at one point brought home a couple of kittens that he had found, and his mother very cruelly killed the kittens. It seems as though Maslow's mother was a very harsh woman, superstitious in some ways, and very condemning of him. It seemed as though she favored the other children and kind of purposefully put down Maslow, and so he had some major issues with his mother. He had issues with his father as well, and so he had a very unhappy childhood, as unfortunately we see with many of the personality theorists we've discussed, although Maslow did later have some kind of reconciliation with his father, who was kind of in and out of the picture as far as his family is concerned. But he never really reconciled with his mother and ended up refusing to go to her funeral. And so that is something that's an issue for him. So he decided to pursue a degree in psychology. And he was influenced by several other theorists. Alfred Adler we already spoke of. Fromm and Horney we have not talked about this semester. We just don't have enough time to go through every single theorist, but some important theorists that he spoke with. And then he continued to work in the field of psychology, was actually the president of the American Psychological Association for a brief period of time before he passed away. So Freud is probably the name that most people have heard of, but Maslow is also a pretty common one. His hierarchy of needs is something that is mentioned several times. I don't know if any of you ever read The Fault in Our Stars. I'm not talking about watching the movie, but actually in the book, it's mentioned. I remember reading, I will admit to the fact that I read that book, and Maslow's hierarchy of needs was mentioned there, as we'll touch on in a second. So, Maslow's basic view of motivation. And so what is motivation? Motivation is a force that drives our behavior. It is something that causes us to act. And so we are all motivated to different degrees, perhaps, and in different ways. But if we weren't motivated, nothing would ever happen, right? So Maslow has a view that we have this holistic approach that all of the different aspects of our personality are all striving toward these basic motivations, these basic needs that we're going to talk about. Now, motivation is complex, and as Maslow would say, there could be some unconscious processes that also play a role as well. And Maslow would say that people are constantly motivated. Now, what we're going to see as we go through, and we've already touched on a bit, is that we kind of move from one motivation to the next. So if the first motivation is met, then we move on to the second motivation and then the third motivation. So what we are motivated toward might vary depending on where we are with the other motivations. But we are constantly motivated by something, which is why we continue growing, we continue developing, we continue to search out new experiences. Now, something that Maslow would say is that these motivations we're going to talk about are basically part of being human. And so we're going to see very similar approaches to these throughout different cultures. Now, the way that you go about meeting the need might differ from one culture to the next. But the fact that the need is there and that we're motivated to meet it is going to be fairly similar across cultures, and that they can be arranged in a hierarchy where some of our needs are most basic, most important to our survival, and then there are going to be some that are so high and so complex that Maslow would say many people do not actually satisfy those needs. Alright, so here we go. When we're talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the basic idea here has to do with these basic needs, and these are the ones that we hear about the most. So picture this with me, that at the bottom level of our pyramid here we have physiological needs. So we cannot, according to Maslow, we cannot possibly try to meet our other needs unless our physiological needs are met first. So these are the most basic needs, and usually the ones that are fulfilled the most. So your physiological needs have to do with what you need to stay alive, right? We need water, we need food, we need oxygen, right? So our physiological needs are keeping ourselves alive. If your physiological needs are met, then Maslow would say after you meet those, then you're able to pursue the next layer of your needs, which are going to go up a little bit. They're going to be a little bit more complex. And so if we have our physiological needs unmet, so an individual who perhaps is starving, doesn't have access to appropriate nutrition, then Maslow would say that that individual is not likely to be able to achieve these other needs. They can't even think about them because their physiological needs are not met. So assuming that our physiological needs are met, we go up to the next level, which has to do with your safety needs. So safety needs mean that you feel safe, right? And just like it sounds, that you are not concerned that someone is going to attack you, that you're able to wake up in the morning and go to work and go about your day and feel safe. Now, in our culture, we often do feel safe. It depends on what neighborhood you live in, but we often think about, in our country, we tend to feel fairly safe. In other countries, think about countries that are filled with war and conflict perpetually, where those individuals don't feel safe, then Maslow would say they're not able to move on to the next level because they are not able to meet those safety needs. So then moving up from safety needs, our next layer, the next most complex layer of our needs is love and belongingness. So if we have enough to eat, we have clean water, we have air to breathe, we feel safe in our environment, now once those are met, we can think about needing love. So Maslow would say this is part of humanity, to want to belong with others and to have meaningful relationships. So this might look like having a romantic relationship, having children, having friendships, having family. So feeling that you belong somewhere and that you can be who you are, right? Love. If this is met, then Maslow would say we can go on to thinking about our esteem needs. Now, someone who is kind of stuck here, who does not feel like they have healthy relationships, they don't feel like they have people who love them and where they belong, those individuals, according to Maslow, would not be able to start thinking about meeting their esteem needs because they're stuck here. But assuming that we have love and belongingness, then we can move up to our esteem needs. So this individual now, they have what they need to survive, they feel safe, they have healthy relationships, now they can work towards developing self-esteem. So feeling confident in themselves, feeling good about themselves. Maybe this means having a good job or getting a promotion at work. Maybe it means doing well in school, getting good grades, graduating, getting a degree. Your esteem needs would be making you feel good about yourself. Now, self-actualization is going to be at the very peak of that pyramid. And one thing we're going to note here, and you're going to see more about this on future slides, is that Maslow would say not everyone achieves self-actualization. Okay? So, in fact, probably the majority of people don't. And we're going to talk about why people don't achieve self-actualization in a second, but you can imagine that you have to have met all of these other needs before you can achieve self-actualization. So if you don't have all of these taken care of, you cannot. And there are some other criteria as well that we'll talk about. But a self-actualized person is kind of like someone who has truly met their highest potential. Someone who is truly the best version of themselves, which is maybe the best way to explain self-actualization here. So feeling good about yourself here. Now, those are the basic needs. And so when we're talking about this hierarchy of needs, we're going to be building from the most basic, the ones that are maybe easiest to satisfy perhaps, all the way up to self-actualization, like the fullest development of the self. Now, there are other needs as well, and Maslow would say that self-actualized people also meet their aesthetic needs and their cognitive needs. So aesthetic needs, when you're hearing about something being like aesthetic or aesthetically attractive, it's like something that is beautiful, something that is in order, something that makes sense. Okay? Cognitive needs has to do with, just like it says here, curiosity and knowledge. So it's very important for us, and we are kind of designed to have this need for information, this need to constantly be learning and growing. And so the type of cognitive needs that you have might vary. The things that you're curious about, the things that you enjoy reading about, the things that you enjoy studying might be different from other people, but we all have this innate curiosity about the world. The same way might be for your aesthetic needs. Maybe the way that you approach this beauty, maybe it's art, maybe it's music. There could be so many different things here. We might approach this need in different ways, but the core of the need is the same for all of us. Now, neurotic needs are a little bit different here. It seems like all of these other needs are the good needs. We want all of these. Now, neurotic needs, according to Maslow, we all possess neurotic needs to some extent, and neurotic needs are going to create a problem here. So, neurotic needs, it says an unproductive relating to other people. So, this would be like perhaps someone's desire to dominate other people or to be in control, someone who maybe puts down other people, or they are very proud and they look down on other people to make them feel better about themselves. Any way that you respond to other people in a negative way, in an unproductive way, in an unhealthy way would be considered a neurotic need. Now, one thing to note about neurotic needs is that whether you act on them or not, Maslow says they're still going to cause you problems. In other words, a person who has a strong desire to dominate and put down other people will have psychological issues because of that. Whether they actually go out and do it or whether they don't, they're still going to have psychological, like the very need to dominate other people creates psychological problems. Whereas for these other things, Maslow would say you're going to have psychological problems if your safety needs are not met. Right? You're going to feel anxious. You're going to have psychological problems if your love and belongingness needs are not met. You're going to be lonely. But he might say you're going to have psychological problems with your neurotic needs whether you meet them or not. The very fact that they are there is going to create problems. Okay? And we're going to have to come face to face with that. Now, a few things to keep in mind when we're thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It says reversed order of needs here. So let me go back for a second. You see that this is the order that Maslow suggested. Physiological needs first, then safety, then love and belongingness, then esteem, then self-actualization. So when we're talking about a reverse order of needs, is it possible that because of love and belongingness, we might give up our safety needs or our physiological needs? According to like the basic premise here, no. You cannot be concerned with love and belongingness needs if your physiological needs are not met. But let's think about an example here that could be an exception. Imagine that a mother is in a terrible situation where she doesn't have enough food to feed herself and her children. Could you see that out of love, she could then give everything that she has to keep herself alive to her children, that she could abandon her own physiological needs because of love needs, if that makes sense. It's the possibility that sometimes we put ourselves in dangerous situations, right? As a parent, I would happily and without a moment's hesitation jump in front of a bullet or a car for my children. Well, Maslow would say that doesn't make sense unless there is this reversed order of needs. So a parent might be willing to forsake their own safety needs because of love. And so we do see a reversal in the order there sometimes. I referred earlier to The Fault in Our Stars, which, spoiler alert, if you haven't already seen that, it's an okay movie. It's a pretty good book. But the idea is that there are two teenagers who have pretty serious illnesses, and they fall in love with each other. And I won't go into any more detail than that in case you haven't seen it or read it yet and you would like to. But the female lead, she talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and how she disagreed with it because she said, because she had a terminal diagnosis, she had no safety. Like there was no way for her to be safe. But just because her safety needs could not be satisfied did not mean that she wasn't able to think about love and esteem and belongingness and even self-actualization. So one criticism of Maslow might be that sometimes we find ourselves in situations where those basic needs are not met. Does that necessarily mean that we cannot achieve the other needs as well? Okay? So something to keep in mind here. Now, we're talking about deprivation of our needs. We're talking about an individual here who is not having their needs met. Okay? So this could be any of their needs. It could be their physiological needs, could be their safety needs, could be their love needs, whatever the case may be. Anytime your needs are not met, it's going to be causing you some psychopathology. It's going to be causing you some issues. And the idea of metapathology here has to do with kind of not having a purpose in life, not having a goal, not knowing what you should be striving for. So whenever our needs are not met, we're kind of frustrated there. We're not able to move on with our hierarchy. We're not able to search for and try to meet higher needs. Then we don't really know what to do with our lives. We're just kind of wandering aimlessly, right? And Maslow would say that this is really instinctual, that it is part of human nature for us to have these needs, that this hierarchy is basically the same throughout the world, and that this is something maybe that brings us together, right? And instead of focusing on our differences, focusing on the ways that we are similar, and that we all have these needs that are very similar to each other that we want to satisfy. Now, it's important to know this about higher and lower needs. So When I say lower needs, I mean the ones that are lower on the hierarchy, so like physiological needs. But just because that's a lower need or a more basic need does not mean it's less important. In fact, Maslow would say it's most important, because if one of those lower needs is not met, you can't achieve any of the higher needs. So the lower needs, while they are more basic, they're more foundational. So you cannot build unless you have those lower needs met. So although the higher needs might seem like they're more complex than they are, you can't approach those until you've met your lower needs as well. All right, so self-actualization is at the very top of Maslow's hierarchy. It is being the best version of you. Now, Maslow would say that most individuals don't quite make it here, and some of us get closer than others, but the idea is that to be a self-actualized person, you have to meet these 4 criteria. And then there's also going to be on future slides a pretty long list of characteristics that you should look for when you're trying to figure out if a person or if you yourself are self-actualized. So, first of all here, Maslow says that an individual has to be free from psychopathology in order to be self-actualized. Well, I just was disqualified right here. I have OCD, so I probably would not be considered self-actualized according to Maslow. But Maslow's thinking here is that an individual who has psychopathology, they're having some kind of psychological issue, which could be any number of things, from an anxiety disorder to a mood disorder to a substance use disorder to a personality disorder, that's going to hinder a person from being self-actualized, right? Now, it also says they have to progress through their hierarchy of needs, so you cannot become self-actualized if those other more basic needs have not been met as well. But one thing to note is that going through those first levels, those first 4 levels of needs, doesn't necessarily mean you're ready for self-actualization. So you might have your physiological needs met and your safety needs met and your love needs met and your esteem needs met. That doesn't mean you're ready for self-actualization. In addition to that, you also have to embrace what Maslow called B values, which are a little bit more complex values, things like truth and goodness and beauty and justice. These a little bit more like existential ideas here. And then you also have to be able to embrace and develop your own talents and capacities and potentials. So then, the self-actualized person is one who is free from psychological issues. They have met their physiological safety, love, and esteem needs. They have a good hold on beauty and justice and truthfulness and all of that. And they also are the best version of themselves. They have fully accepted who they are, and they have grown in their talents and abilities. So, as you can see, not everyone would fall in this category according to Maslow, right? So, looking a little bit more closely at characteristics of self-actualizing people, and there are a lot. It's this slide and then another slide. So there are several of these here. So Maslow would say that a self-actualized person has an efficient perception of reality. Okay, what we mean here is that they are very good at reading their environment and reading other people. So they're not likely to be manipulated or to be lied to. They see right through someone who is being phony with them, in other words, right? They also accept themselves and others and nature, right? So they feel comfortable with who they are, so they feel like they can be sincere, right? They have their own personal, ideals and ideas, but they don't feel like they have to fit in with other people. They feel secure in who they are. Being spontaneous, simple, natural, problem-centered, so they are comfortable with solving problems and with focusing on problems that are outside of themselves, right? They don't necessarily feel like a problem is something internal to themselves that would create psychopathology, but more just like a problem is an issue and we need to solve it without kind of internalizing it. And maybe this is something that they want to spend their life doing, is to solving problems. So this might play a role in the kind of career that they choose, right? So a scientist who wants to do research, or an attorney who fights for justice, or someone in government, something like that, right? The need for privacy means that these individuals are comfortable being alone. So That's not necessarily meaning that they're an introverted person, but that they don't mind being on their own. They are comfortable with that, and they do like to have some privacy, right? So some individuals feel like being alone is almost a punishment to them. They don't enjoy being by themselves, but solitude would be a good thing for the self-actualized person. Autonomy, so feeling like they can act on their own, to be independent, to make their own decisions. A freshness of appreciation, so someone who is constantly looking for beauty in life and seeing. It doesn't matter how many sunsets you have seen in your life, each one is unique and is beautiful and is special, right? So something very simple, like enjoying a delicious meal, or something more complex. It doesn't matter. They're able to continue to feel how amazing something is, even if they've experienced it several times, which is a wonderful thing, and we should all try to have a freshness to the way that we approach things. A peak experience has to do with kind of a transcendence or a transcending experience here. This could be someone who had like a religious experience perhaps, or some kind of just like intense experience here that's a little bit hard to describe, but kind of this moment of being caught up in the awe and the beauty of something outside of yourself, right? Also, feeling of oneness with all of humanity. So this like social interest idea that's kind of similar to Adler's. The idea that we should try to have good relationships with other people. Profound interpersonal relations, continuing on with that thought. The person who is self-actualized is likely to have good relationships. They don't necessarily have to have a lot of relationships. You may know people who their self-worth is tied up in how many Facebook friends they have and how many people they hang out with. That's not necessarily the case here with a self-actualizing person. According to Maslow, they're likely to have high-quality relationships, maybe fewer relationships, but better relationships. When we talk about the democratic character structure, this is basically an individual who doesn't show any kind of prejudice. So they kind of overlook those characteristics that sometimes our society gets so hung up on, looking for the true nature of the person rather than looking at their appearance, their race, their religious beliefs, the amount of money they have. Instead of focusing on those characteristics that we use to put people in groups and make stereotypes about people, they would focus more on the actual person themselves, right? And then we're seeing someone here discriminating between means and ends. So understanding this basically goes back to like what is right and what is wrong and what is moral, and having good character there. Having a sense of humor, especially a philosophical, more complex, deeper sense of humor. Being creative, which the way in which they are creative might vary from person to person, but they're not afraid to take risks. They're willing to put themselves out there and try new things. And then resistance to enculturation means that they have their own, if you're self-actualized, you have your own identity, you have your own ideas, you have your own beliefs, and even if your society disagrees with you about those things, that's okay. You don't feel like you have to kind of change who you are to fit in with society, right? Now, all of those long characteristics, those long list of characteristics here, it seems difficult to think of someone who has all of these characteristics at one potential point in their lives. When we're talking about love, Maslow suggested that perhaps all people are capable of feeling love, but self-actualized people are going to experience love in a different way. The way that he talked about this is that an individual who is not self-actualized, they might have a love built on deficiencies. In other words, their relationships are kind of always centered around the flaws or the faults of the other person. On the other hand, he would say that a self-actualized person is able to feel this love without expecting anything in return. So it's kind of a more selfless love, a deeper love, that even if the other person doesn't necessarily love you back or reciprocate in the way that would please you, you're still capable of loving that person. All right, so Maslow suggests that we all have an ability to become self-actualized, perhaps, but things get in our way and they prevent us from doing that. And so when we're talking about the way of viewing the world, Maslow argued for a humanistic, holistic approach that is not value-free. In other words, Maslow would suggest that oftentimes when we do research and when we do therapy, we try to approach things in like a cold, calculated, scientific way without considering values. The problem with that, according to Maslow, is that basically all humans have values and have beliefs and have ideas and have their own personal goals, and that we cannot be cold and separated from that and still help our clients. So then we should be, and you'll see this more next week when we talk about Rogers. He's going to talk a little bit more in detail about how a therapist would actually do this with a client. But we need to be sincere with our clients. We need to try to develop a relationship with them, show them how we really feel, and not trying to be this kind of like cold. You need to be professional with your clients, but it's the idea that you need to show them your emotion, not to be a robot, basically, with your clients. And so you'll see more of this when we talk about Carl Rogers, but this is a call from Maslow for psychologists to remember that we're dealing with humans here, and we need to act like it. So, how are we going to measure someone's self-actualization? Excuse me. The idea with your measuring self-actualization, we're trying to measure whether a person has reached their peak ability level, whether this person has reached the best version of themselves. There are a couple of different measures that have been created to try to measure self-actualization, and basically what they're measuring is core self-actualization, so some of those things that we've already talked about, specifically also autonomy, so being able to act on your own. Someone who is very clingy and needy and dependent and can't make decisions on their own would struggle here, versus someone who is capable of being alone, someone who, once again, comfort with solitude, and someone who feels like they can make up their own mind without having everyone else tell them what to do. Also, being open to experience. We're going to see that there are a few other personality theories that are going to include openness to experience. We're going to touch on the third section of the class, but openness to experience is related to a lot of the things we talked about with self-actualization. So being creative and looking at things with a fresh eye and pursuing new experiences, right? And then, as we said, being comfortable with being alone. These are just a few of those core features for self-actualization that the measures try to get an idea of where we are in each one of these. So then, as a therapist, you could give one of these measures to your client, have them fill it out, and then try to figure out what area they need to work on more to help them develop self-actualization. So, something that you might see, according to Maslow, in yourself or in your clients would be something that Maslow called the Jericho Complex, which the Jericho Complex, it says, is an abnormal syndrome defined as the fear of being or doing one's best. So Maslow would say that we are all created to be self-actualized, to reach our full potential, but sometimes we are afraid. We're afraid of reaching our full potential. Maybe it's because we're afraid that if we step out and we take a risk, then we might be embarrassed or we might fail. So sometimes we don't reach our best potential. We're not self-actualized because we're afraid of what would happen if we tried and we failed. So sometimes we see this with individuals who they feel like it's better for them not to try at all, because if they don't try at all, then they can kind of blame it on something else. But if they try and they fail, then there's nothing to blame it on but themselves. And so people are afraid of this. So then Maslow would say we have to try to find a way to help our clients and help ourselves and help the people that we care about get over this fear and help people to take risks. Remember that being a risk taker in an appropriate way, right? Maybe standing up for something that you believe in or working hard to achieve a goal, that kind of thing is good for us, makes us more likely to be self-actualized. So Maslow would say we need to try to find a way to get around this. Now, sometimes people say, well, I'm not afraid of being my best. I'm trying really hard to be my best. And Maslow might say, well, okay, sometimes this looks like false humility. The person who is trying to be humble and let other people take control and let other people be in charge, and they try to seem like that because they're actually really afraid of doing something on their own. So we need to take risks in a healthy way. Obviously, I'm not telling you guys to go out and do something dangerous, but Maslow would say, like, asking out that person that you want to date, or trying to get that promotion at work, trying to become the best version of yourself is a risk worth taking, according to Maslow. Good? All right, so how are we going to help our clients? Well, as we've already said, we want to help our clients work towards self-actualization. Maybe we need to help them identify their own fears about being their best selves and help them overcome those fears. One thing in particular that Maslow would emphasize is freeing them from their dependence on others. So sometimes when we find ourselves dependent on other people, it stifles all of those things that play a role in whether or not we're self-actualized, right? So if we're dependent on other people, we're not likely to have healthy relationships. I mean, if we're excessively dependable. I mean, you need to depend on other people. But if you are constantly clinging to someone else and everything about who you are is tied up in another person, then Maslow would say you can't have healthy relationships. You cannot be creative here. And so then that's going to stifle your ability to be self-actualized. Remember that Maslow said that to be self-actualized, you need to be comfortable being alone. And so sometimes individuals are not experiencing that. So maybe perhaps we need to help them see that their over-dependence on other people could be potentially harming their psychological health, and then helping them make steps towards overcoming that. Once again, remember that therapy must not be value-free. It should not be cold and scientific necessarily. Humanistic therapy is all about developing a rapport or a relationship between the therapist and the client, and then helping the client reach his or her goals. It's an emotional thing. You create a connection with the client, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. You'll see some therapists that are very staunchly opposed to having like a personal connection with the client, or in like sharing information about yourself with the client in a way that is helpful for the client. You'll see others that are more willing to include a little bit more of their personal emotions, their personal reactions. So sometimes it may be that that client has no one else in their life that will tell them the truth. And sometimes if you, in a kind way, tell them the truth about your reaction to them or your reaction to something that they say, that could be really important for them. Maybe help them realize something that they haven't before. So we're going to try to keep emotion. We're going to use emotion as a tool to help our client. Of course, we don't want to be overly emotional here, but we do want to try to help our clients to understand and to achieve their own goals. And so we need to remember that we're working with humans and not robots here. So when we're talking about Maslow's theory, it's very high in organizing knowledge based on what we know. It's high on guiding the action of the therapist, helping the therapist. Okay, we need to figure out what needs are being met, what needs are not being met, how we can get those needs met, what steps do we need to take to help our client get closer to self-actualization. It is moderate on generating research, so kind of in the middle there. Moderate on internal consistency. Remember, just as an example of this, that we do sometimes see a reversal of needs where, for example, someone might give up their physiological needs or their safety needs because of their love and esteem needs, for example. So there are some things that are not necessarily explained by this theory, so kind of in the middle there. And also parsimony, which remember kind of goes back to our idea of, is it simple? It doesn't need to be overly complex. It's low on falsifiability, as many of the personality theorists we're going to talk about this semester are. It is difficult to prove that something is not true, which means it's also difficult to prove that it is true. Okay. Looking at Maslow's kind of ideas here of humanity, remember that Maslow was someone who was kind of bothered by the psychoanalytic way of thinking of things. So he's going to have free choice here over determinism, that we all choose to pursue the things that are good for us or to not pursue the things that are good for us, right? So he's going to focus on optimism. He's going to focus on the future rather than feeling like we're already determined based on our past. He's going to focus on conscious motivations, although there may be some unconscious motivations. They're working together. Relatively equal focus on nature and nurture, so on your culture, your nurture, your environment, as well as your biology or your nature. A little bit more on uniqueness and the unique ways that you perceive or pursue your personal needs there, right? All right, so the last thing for this week, we're going to talk about Activity 6. So Activity 6 asks you to weigh in on self-actualization, kind of the peak of Maslow's theory. So what are your thoughts on self-actualization? is it possible to meet all of Maslow's criteria? So all of the different things that we talked about that you should look for in an individual that is self-actualized. Do any of us actually meet all of those? Maybe yes, maybe no. And do we have to meet all of them to be self-actualized? What I'm thinking about here, is it possible for someone who has psychopathology to still be self-actualized? Is it possible for someone who is not in a romantic relationship to be self-actualized? Just thinking about all of the needs that Maslow said need to be met in order for us to be able to achieve self-actualization, what are your thoughts on that? Is it possible to meet all of those needs, and is it necessary, right? So I'm really just looking for your opinion on whether or not we can reach self-actualization this week, okay? All right, so that is the end of the lecture for today. So remember that you do have an activity due by Friday at 5 p.m. Next week, we will not have an activity, but we will have exam 2 coming up. So after next week's lecture on Rogers, we will have exam 2. So we'll talk more about that next time. I'll be posting a review video just like for exam 1. Please feel free to email me or come by during my office hours if you need anything. Otherwise, I will talk to you guys next week.